I should start with this rubber brain I've brought here tonight, which I pinched from a neuroscientist. I said, it was on his desk, and I said, "What is it?" And he said, "It's a rubber brain." And I said, "Can I have it, please?" And he didn't want to give it to me, but I took it away from him anyway.
Now, it's not an eraser.
No, well, I haven't tried it. It doesn't have a squeak, so my dog doesn't want it. But most of you here will know that, as I do, that the right-hand side of the brain usually is responsible for the visual, and the left hand we associate with language processing, and with our right hand, the right-hand side of the brain with our left hand. As a writer who began as a physicist, then became a designer, a filmmaker, radio writer, I have this preconception that an artist is entirely right-brain oriented, and that all writers are entirely left-brain oriented. I don't think that's right, is it?
Oh no, I think inevitably there's lots of bleeding over the areas. But I'm actually going to come back to you, because I'm just quite curious about you saying that you started off as a physicist.
Well, I started off being good in physics and discovering very quickly, everyone says, was there a glass ceiling because you're a woman? I said, no, I was just really rubbish at physics. I got to the first year of university and thought, however, it did stay with me. I've always had an interest in science.
But what was it specifically about physics that made you decide at the tender age of 18, yes, I will now go on and I will study this for 3 years?
Two ideas, chaos and entropy.
Right. Well, they're really small ideas to start with.
The whole idea of the chaotic. And my first novel had a chaotic quality to it because it was about the monsoon in India. But the question I want to ask you is a supposedly right-brain person, do you ever use any words? I mean, are you inspired by words, or do you just, pick up an angel's bone and...
An angel's bone. Words are incredibly important to the way I think, the way I work. If I collect anything, I collect books. As I found out, as we've had to move out of our house and studio, and we were trying to shift about 200 or 300 books, and also my partner, who I work with, Dan Harvey. His father was a writer, and we have books that he wrote and collected. So I just realised we have this house full of books, but I can't quite let them go. And I think with when I was studying at college, I was doing the very first college course that actually encouraged people to mix across the art forms, to transgress the boundaries. And this was in 1977. I didn't do a foundation course, absolutely. I didn't do a foundation course. I was interested in theatre and performance, and I was very interested in visual arts. And I had a phobic fear of exams, phobic, to the point that I would collapse and have to go into Valium if anybody sat me down.
You should try doing physics exams.
I couldn't. It actually made me physically ill. It made me feel physically ill. Now, this college course it was a degree in creative arts, and you could pick one of 5 disciplines. There was creative writing, music, sculpture, visual arts, dance and drama. So I did visual arts and drama, and the whole thing was about the hybrid nature of it. And
that's very interesting for me, because from looking at some of your work, the thing that strikes me is the whole concept of how in some of the pieces there's a narrative, there's a story, there's a beginning and an ending. So, for example, if you grow an oak tree, you hope that there isn't an ending that's going to come too quickly. And in my own books, obviously in a book, at the end of when you finish the book and they publish it, you can't go back and change it however much you want to. However
it's sealed.
Much,
the fate of that book is sealed.
When a critic says she did too much research, which I love, and she should have spent more time plotting, which I agree with, and you think, if only the editor had said that, I would go back, but it's too late. There it is, it's fixed. Now, I'm interested because you have some work that continues. For example, your grass pieces, it has a beginning and it carries on, but it's still a story which progresses.
It is a story.
But then some things are fixed.
Yeah.
How do do you do that? First of all, I can understand why you have a story, but how do you decide, okay, this is the one we're going to do, this time we're going to grow a crystal bone or whatever?
Yeah. I'm sort of like looking
Where did the
down.
grass come from?
I'm looking down over sort of 20 odd years, 30 years of making. And okay, to pin down, I think at its core, there's an impulse for me to grow. I need to grow, and I need to grow seeds, even though we've extended that to growth, inorganic growth. And we've stepped into chemistry and biology. Actually, I need the idea that seed is a catalyst. It's life. It's life. And there was something about the inanimate sculptural form that did not excite me. I just was not interested in even the idea of a kinetic sculpture that was mechanistic and could move. Did not excite me. It just didn't.
But how did you move from theatre into grass?
Well, what actually happened was Cornelia Parker, who is not here tonight, by a fantastic grace of time and place, Cornelia Parker was the artist in residence at the college that I studied at. Now, of course, I had no idea at the time who Cornelia Parker was. I had a Nissen hut to myself, and, I was playing around, messing around with plaster and, discovering almost in my first year at college what most people do at a foundation course. And maybe I was in the second year, and somebody said, actually, we need to divvy up your space because the artist in residence is going to have half of it. So I said, okay, fine, And the very first time I met Cornelia Parker, she just opened the door and she went, hello, and I went, hello, and she had on this hand-knitted tie. And I just thought, God, she looks great, actually. I really liked her. And Connie became an enormous influence. But what Cornelia did that really activated the material that I've spent 25, 30 years dedicated to, really, was she took us on a study week to work with the artist David Nash. I don't know if anybody knows David Nash. He works in Blaenau Festiniog. He has a studio. And he was just very generous. There were about 5 or 6 of us. And he took us out to to these hillsides. And he was planting trees. And as the trees were growing, he was starting to sculpt the trees. And I just hadn't seen anything quite like this. And I just thought, this is very, very, very interesting, because what I suddenly realized, actually, I don't think I even analyzed it, to be honest. But what I found very compelling was that he was dealing with the 4th dimension of time. He wasn't dealing just with the 3-dimensional object. He was dealing when a tree grows.
It's very anatomical here, isn't it?
It is very anatomical.
This was not a plan.
It wasn't a plan. It's come about. And I went straight back to college, and I went straight to the gardeners, and I said, "Could I please have some grass seed?" And, I gave them a little bit of money I had, and I started to go back to the studio, and I grew. I went to another department. I got some light fabric. I sprinkled on the grass seed very densely, and I watered it. I didn't put any soil in it, hardly any soil. And after about 10 days, 2 weeks, I had this sheet of grass, and it was gravity defying. And I just thought,
what year was this?
Isn't something that I walk on any longer. 1978 or 79.
Good God.
1978 to 79.
Because I first saw you work in 97.
But it's the gravity-defying nature of it that absolutely... So in some ways, I was moving away from the earth and from the decomposition, and I was looking at the aerial, the light, almost like the lightness, the gravity-defying nature of something.
I saw Heather's work for the first time because we both won a Sci-Art Award in 1997. And I was working with a physicist at the time. I was very unhappy, and I was working as an artist. I was the artist, he was the scientist. And I was very unhappy with what we had produced. And the embarrassing thing for me was that we then had to go along to the Wellcome Trust and present what we'd done. And I was just, and then the worst thing, even worse than that, was the artist and scientist before me was Heather and Dan, and basically a chlorophyll geneticist.
Yeah, a scientist. He fondly known as Sid, but...
and you showed this. I don't know if have you seen Heather's work? She showed this, or they showed this amazing vertical photograph in grass in which the image of a mother and child was growing through
That
it.
one there.
And have you got it up there? Yeah.
That's it there, yeah. It's quite faint, but just to kind of show
And
yeah.
I went away, and at that time I'd already written my first novel, and I was in the terrible position of having to come up with the idea for the second novel. And I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do? And I saw this and I thought, this is just the most extraordinary thing. And I went away, and the thing that impressed me, I think, most in a way, apart from the fact that you achieved this, was that you'd achieved it with chlorophyll, which to me was the meaning of the colour green. And I'm a great gardener, and I came away and I started to look at it, and one of the things you may wonder why this rather tatty looking box is here. This, by the way, hold on a second, I don't know which way round I'm going to do this. This is the book, Fish, Blood and Bone, that came out of Heather's work. I was totally inspired by it. I wrote this book, but before I did that, I had started to write it, and I was out gardening one day trying to get something that was very yellow to grow, and the way I fertilise the garden is with fish, blood and bone, which is literally ground up bits of, well, you can see it, I'll just pour it out there. There you go, and that becomes green, which is an amazing idea, really. This is it. And I thought, well, there we go.
But then I would think, I mean, and we sort of met.
So that's
at
the
this
beginning.
time.
That's
the beginning of a connection.
But the end of the Fish, Blood and Bone, by the way.
But I would still suggest that for you to go chlorophyll, there is something there which I think has to come back to the love of the garden and the seeds.
Well, it also has to come back to the whole idea that again, back to chlorophyll, which you have spent so many years turning into magical pieces, that the chlorophyll molecule looks unbelievably like the blood molecule, the heme molecule. They are only different by one central, whatever it is, atom, something.
Yes, it is. It is.
Neuron, one of those things.
I'm desperately trying to remember what it is.
Me too. But if you looked at them, if we had them on screen, you would not be able to believe this. They look identical. So the red molecule, if you like, the ultimate red, blood, is incredibly closely related to the ultimate green, which is chlorophyll.
It is.
And I write bloody books too.
Well,
There's a lot of blood in them.
Well, you do. You. There is a sense of. I mean, you have murder in your books.
Lots of them.
Let's get it out. Let's get murder in there.
In fact, somebody once asked me the first novel, how many murders were there in the book? I had no idea.
What was your first novel, actually? Because
it was called Bombay Ice.
And when was that written, Leslie? Was that?
It came out in '98.
In '98.
So that's when just the year after, I was already in the middle of being inspired by your work.
But you were also. But how did? But just to go to Bombay Ice.
Yeah.
Because then what was the cauldron for that piece of work? I mean, what?
Well, I should tell you, I'm a storyteller, so
yeah,
I should tell you a story.
Go on, tell the story.
I was doing a series of radio programs at the time for the BBC about the Indian Spice Trail. I was in India with my husband, and we have a great love of India anyway. And I'd met the most extraordinary people I've ever met in the world. I think it's got the best and the worst of everything in the world. One of the people that I did the program with was a filmmaker. And I kept saying, oh, I really love the things in India that are like the things that I recognize. I love the art. You know, it's like, he said, you've got to stop finding similarities here. He said, you've got to celebrate differences. And he introduced me to a filmmaker who was the last kind of Indian person you would ever expect. He was very passionate about the Cannes Film Festival, French films, French food. He had me around to his house or his flat with his wife and 2 kids, and they talked about gourmet cooking, nothing to do with Indian food, which is what I was interested in. And the next day he took me swimming in a pool shaped like India. So if you imagine that where the earth was, there was water. And that night, after I'd gone swimming with him, I met this woman who was a sort of gossip writer for Bombay, for Bollywood, and she said, I gather you met the murderer. You went swimming with the murderer. And I said, no, this is a really nice filmmaker, you know. And he said, She said, oh yes, he killed his first wife. He pushed her off a balcony. And I thought, well, but I met his second wife, and does she know about this? And she said, well, between husband and wife, who knows? But you notice she stays well away from balconies. Now, needless to say, I could not put that in the Radio 3 program I was making about the Indian spice trail, but it worried and worried and worried away at my brain. And one day I thought, I have to write it down. And that was the germination. That's what the making of the book came out of the making of a radio program, which came out of the making of films. So it was sort of films, radio, sound, theatre, all
that
of those
came
things.
in. But
East and West.
But to try and step one, to come out and try and get an overview, because I think, and you know, Dan and I often say, you know, ideas are 10 a penny. You know, ideas happen in spite of yourself. You know, there's so many stimuli. There are so many things that are demanding our attention. There are so many connections that we make and can perceive and can draw on. So what is it about some ideas that are more compelling than others? What is it that makes that profound association, that makes us somehow get up and physically make something, physically do it? So do you think it was the immersion in the water? Was it that she was a gifted storyteller? Was it that you'd always had a fascination with mysteries and with susceptibility? Do you think? Well, was it swimming in a pool shaped like India?
No. Well, I think all of those came into. Yeah. I mean, I'm always fascinated by the idea of narrative, and people often ask novelists, where do you get your ideas from? Well, as Heather has suggested, it's more a question of how do you choose the idea? How do you decide this is the right idea and that's the wrong idea? And the other question they ask is, do you have the ending in mind when you begin the book? And I never have the ending in mind. I haven't the faintest idea what I begin with something, and I don't know what it is that grabs onto me. In the case of Bombay Ice, and it was rather like Fish, Blood and Bone, I sort of started looking around. I was there at the time of the monsoon. Now, the monsoon in India, people say, oh, you know, we have a monsoon in Britain. It's not a monsoon. The monsoon in India, while I was interviewing the film producer that I mentioned, the murderer, at the end of it, I went outside and our taxi had floated away. It was gone. There was this much water running down the streets, and everybody took it for granted. They had huge umbrellas, and they all took it for granted. Oh, you can't get a taxi now, you have to walk or wade. So that was one thing. So here I was back with this murderer at home in London, going, a murderer, sort of a monsoon, and, you know, there I was. So I started, big physics background, interest in chaos. I started looking up about the physics of storms.
Of storms?
Of storms.
Okay.
And in fact, the other monsoon, and I started looking through all these, and I got more and more involved in the weather. I'm insane for research, so it's a terrible sin, because I spend all the time researching, and then I have not enough time to write the book. I go on researching forever. And following the whole physics of weather, eventually you come to this book this thick, and I haven't the faintest, it's all numbers. And you think, oh my God.
So it's data, you're confronted, at the end of the research, you're confronted with mathematical data. So I was flipping
through this, and at the end of it, it said, was a little bit of paper stuck in it, said, essentially, this is all complete bullshit because we've just discovered chaos. We've just discovered that the weather is influenced by chaos theory, and so we cannot possibly analyse it, which is why we have a general idea when the monsoon happened. At that time, we went to see a production of The Tempest in Edinburgh, and I thought, oh my God, there you go. And I thought about Shakespeare and The Tempest, and the whole idea of change and what was going on. And I structured the book around the story of a murderous filmmaker who all his life, like Orson Welles, had wanted to film an Indian production of Shakespeare's Tempest. Okay. So where on earth did and how did I know that was the right one?
Yes.
Because it just feels right. And does that happen to you?
Well, to go back to your question earlier about books, I think the pivotal piece of work I made was towards the end of my 20s, and I'd worked a lot in the performing arts area with People Show and Impact Theatre Cooperative, Graham Miller, Gary Stevens, working as a performer and contributing very much to the ideas. So the kind of what was called variously visual physical theatre, the avant-garde, the experimental. I mean, people were always trying to find a category to stick on it because it was transgressing boundaries again. It wasn't the pure, easily categorized art. But I was in quite a trauma. I was in quite a dark space personally, and I had to leave my home for various reasons. And I went to stay with a friend, and I just kept having this repeated image. It was almost as I was trying to rest and collect my thoughts and stop the chaos that I felt, almost like a kind of not exactly a nervous breakdown. It's too strong a word, but just a sense of everything in very, very deep disarray.
And a lot of neurons firing at the same time.
A lot of neurons firing, but it was always going into this railed garden space. And there was a woman, and she just had this kind of like red long dress on. And it was almost as if a railing had been plucked out of that which held her and just kind of plummeted down and just slammed into the grass and just caught her. And it wouldn't go. And that was the compelling idea. And out of that was born a piece of work called Uses of Enchantment, which I won't dwell on for too long. But the initial image, what it was, the actual space was a railing garden, and the opening image was one woman on a chest with a pile of books up to her neck. And I was taking texts from books that really excited me. I was reading Marina Warner's Monuments of Maiden. I was reading Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex. I was reading mythology about Pandora opening the chest when she had a crown of spring grasses. I was reading Lysistrata. I was reading a very, very obscure book that I went to research at the British Library called The Life of John Buncle. And
we could have met one another there because I was looking about chaos
it all together. But there was out of this, and it seemed together. But essentially what happened in this railing garden, which was a barren place, was the garden became fertile and the curtains opened and the garden was transformed by this carpet of living grass, which again was the gravity-defying grass that I had laid dormant for the best part of 6 or 7 years until it demanded to come back. And it seized me. It seized me. I can't find any other way to quite describe it. There was a sense of a seizure. And yet I found it electric, and I found it, for the best part of the work I've done with it, it speaks on so many levels. It speaks chlorophyll, it speaks life, it speaks decay, it speaks about the evolution of humanity. It doesn't stop resonating. And I think and then I met Dan because a mutual friend saw this piece of work that I was presenting with. There was, 6 or 7 performers I was working with. And she said, you really, really must meet this artist, Dan Harvey, because he's working with grass. And she met him at a party, and she said, you really must meet Heather Ackroyd, she's working with grass.
She didn't say he was really good looking or anything like that.
No, she didn't say he was really good looking, but I really liked his voice. He left a message on the dance machine. I thought,
sexy,
really nice voice.
A bit of growing.
Well, 28, 29 years old, it was all up for grabs.
And for grass, in fact.
Dan comes from, all up for grass and grasping. Dan has a very, very deep fascination with bones.
I like the way you're holding this.
I know. It's got a great physical. This is bone of a polar bear, actually. But Dan was very much looking at decay and death and bone, and he was almost coming from the ground up, and I was coming from the aerial down, and we met. We found an absolute point of connection, that has led to kind of an enduring relationship, and a child, and
well, in fact, the grass,
and a lot of work.
Was it not the mother and child grass image that I saw at the Wellcome Trust?
That was a piece that was born out of our work with scientists, because that piece of work, you see again, chlorophyll, which you so extraordinarily picked up on. It's actually fugitive. I mean, actually, chlorophyll is fugitive. And when a plant is under stress, for example, this plant, if we would see this plant in summer, this is an oak tree. If this plant was struggling for water or there was too much pollution in the air, what it does is it pulls back the green. So often, as you can see with the lawn, it goes yellow. Now, actually what it's doing is it's saving its energy. So it's kind of going into the root. It's trying to hold itself until it gets the water, it gets the nourishment it needs. And the scientists that we work with actually discovered there's a mutant, a naturally occurring variant of grass that, to all intents and purposes, even when it's really unhealthy, still looks green. We could all aspire to that.
Oh, yeah. Bit late for that.
So
even if you rub some chlorophyll in, it doesn't work. You know.
Bathing in it. And what it allowed us to do was to work with, they had, through Mendel, plant husbandry of breeding one type of plant with another to get a crossbreeding. Howard Sid had found exactly what the pathway was of chlorophyll, which he did with other scientists in Zurich. And they then bred it into a ryegrass so that people could use it. It has drought-resistant capacity. It's drought-resistant.
So it stays green when other things go yellow?
Yeah, and what we could find with these pieces, which when you show a living grass photograph, it's going to be, if it's subjected to too much light, it'll all go green. If you keep on watering it, it'll all start to rot and decompose. So actually what we realised is we could use this grass and we could dry the material. I mean, it sounds almost simplistic now. I mean, the complex was the science, but the simplistic was drying it, which of course is what people do with botanical specimens. Keep it away from light.
That's right.
Yeah.
It was also, I didn't know all the background of this the first time I saw this. And I started writing this novel, which became Fish, Blood and Bone. And I was a year into the work, and my mother died. And she'd been a great gardener as well. And she wanted to be cremated. And I said, are you sure? You don't want to be buried or anything? She said, no, I want to be cremated. And then I want you to put the ashes, euphemistically called ashes, onto the garden, something. And she said, save a few, add a bit every year. And there's some...
to sprinkle it? Don't
some
sprinkle it all in one kind of like...
Yeah, not just so, here we go, a little urn, but you see...
But that's almost like,
Oh yeah, it is. Now you see this, you think, there you go, Mum's ashes. That is Fish, Blood and Bone.
Why is it fish?
Well, my mum, it's actually not my mum, just so you know. This is just straight out of the same box
of
Fish, Blood and Bone. However, Mum didn't look that much different. And I come from the west coast of Canada originally, where we ate a lot of fish. So there we went. I had Mum, but I was also fascinated by the whole idea of what regenerates, the fact that you put death into the soil and you get life out of this. But I was also fascinated by, and I think it starts to come through from this, I saw this and I thought, mother and child, fish, blood and bone, how do we know, once we've put that into the soil, which bit is mum and which bit is earth, which bit is the plant? And that whole idea, also, you're talking about trees, I also thought about family trees.
Yeah, okay.
So the family tree came into it, and the whole idea of what a family tree is. And meanwhile, back in India, we went for another trip to India, and I wanted to go and see the great banyan tree in the Calcutta Botanic Gardens.
This is a sacred tree.
It is a sacred tree. It was supposed to be the biggest banyan tree in the world. When I got there, my husband went with me, this banyan tree, which was probably as big as this room, but I don't know if you know what a banyan tree does. It drops its branches down, and the branches root. And the branches become a sacred grove, if you like. So what had happened over the years is that the center of the banyan tree had died out, and what had grown were all these trees, a sacred grove around it. And you had talked about sacred groves, and you had talked about the contained garden. And Fish, Blood and Bone became the story of basically an enchanted garden, an enchanted grove, and a girl who inherits it and begins to try to find out who made this garden, which takes her to India, where she discovers that she's related to an anonymous Indian botanical artist from the early 19th century who worked in living plants and painted from them. So when you start telling me, I didn't hear any of these stories about heather until I'd written this book. And then we must be on the same wavelength, because I kept reading about heather and thinking, is she copying this from me or am I copying this from her? Where is it coming from?
But it is, because when Dan was first introduced to my work, his friends said, you should see this woman, she's copying you. Cheek.
Grass on the cover.
But, and I felt the same with Dan, whether or not you call it correspondence or synchronicity, at the time I was very interested in the work of, I've had a sip of wine, and I always say I can never,
I stopped.
Not Freud.
Which one?
Oh, the other great. Jung, absolutely Jung.
There we go.
So I was doing a lot of reading about, about the subconscious collective, and so when I met Dan, there was some kind of affirmation of that. And actually, Dan and I made our first piece of work together, and then I went to Zurich, and I actually made a trip down to the house that Carl Jung built on the edges of Lake Zurich, and I knocked on the door, and his great-grandson opened it and said, "Come in." And
this is just unbelievable.
And it was
I've
just
never heard
pure
about
and
this all this sort
utter
of magic.
Pure and utter chance, really, that did that. And also when I met Dan, his father had been writing a book called Plaiting the Magic, and he was very much into myth as well. And his great-grandfather had written a book called The Garden of Enchantment.
Good
so
God.
There were all of these extraordinary overlays. But I think what's quite interesting is I think our work has become much more distilled. I think there's a point now where the way we're making work is actually quite different to how we were making work.
Is that a conscious decision?
I think it's part of a process. I think it's, we're older, we are working in different ways. There are different constraints on us. We don't want to fly all over the place any longer. We have a 12-year-old daughter. We want to give her some stability and some kind of connection, even if not so much for the education, but at least with her friends and her peers, that she's not kind of constantly being pulled off and having to live our life all the time. But
she'll probably become an accountant,
or a dentist. I hope she's not leaving. I hope she's not leaving art college with 25. No, I'm joking. £25,000 debt. We struggle now to make a living.
I think it's very true. When you mention a dentist,
actually, I think being an artist is the only way. And actually, it comes back to this piece as well, which I'll just talk about very briefly about the trees. This acorn, this tree here is one of about. I think we've got about 250, maybe 300, I'm not sure. And the acorns were collected from a very famous seminal artwork called 7,000 Oaks by the German artist Joseph Beuys. And Joseph Beuys is probably one of the most influential and most highly regarded artists of the 20th century. He died in 1986, and actually he did the first planting he planted the first tree in 1982. And at that point, he was already ill. He died of a cancer of the lung. And a year after he died, the last tree of the 7,000 that are planted in the city of Kassel in Germany was planted by his son. Beuys always said that the tree was a sculpture. He talked about it. He talked about 7,000 Oaks as being a time sculpture. And if you think that his trees now are about 27, 30 years old, they're juvenile trees, really, because an oak tree can... it comes into maturity about 60, 70, 80 years old. And they don't really start to produce viable acorns until they're about 20, 25 years old. But left unhurt, uncut, unpolluted, undamaged, they can live for many, 300, 400 years. And I actually read recently, and this really amazed me, that apparently they cannot actually say that a tree ever dies of old age. Now that's big, isn't it? I thought that was one of those things that I kind of thought, I'm still wrestling with that notion.
How many cups of fish blood and
trees
bone
die.
keep it going?
The reason trees die is because they're cut down, or because they're diseased. And pathogens at the moment, there are various pathogens, that are hitting the oak because of what's happening with the shifting climate. But we're taking the opportunity. I mean, again, it's a growing project, but it's one that's much longer. The graph had a kind of temporality to it. It had an ephemerality to it, which utterly and totally embrace. But this is a much, much longer term project. And it is about generation. And Boyce talked about it being generation, about a time sculpture. And he was going back to the time of the Druids. He was going back to the Celtic times. You know, and actually he said, well, the word Druid comes from the Celtic word, which actually means oak tree. And if you look back through somebody like Robert Graves, who wrote the beautiful book, well, he wrote the Greek myth books, and actually it comes from a very old word called dua, which means door, and the door is made of oak.
We're approaching these things. It amazes me, Heather. It really does. When you think about making, quite by accident, or perhaps not by accident, who knows, you and I have, and Dan, have been playing with similar ideas and coming up with completely different
manifestations of it.
Yeah. Because sorry, go ahead.
No, but are we a sign of our times? Is that to do with what is presented to us?
I think I'm a sign of my travels. I really do. I think that I left Vancouver when I was, I suppose, 16. I went to school somewhere else, and I never stopped travelling. And I have only stopped travelling recently for a reason which I will tell you in a minute. But you're talking about myth, and my third novel, Waking Raphael, came out of two things. One was a myth, and one was someone who tries to he's actually a scientist who, when he's not practicing his science, spends his life trying to disprove religious myths. This is in Italy. And the thing, I think, two things generated this, both kind of having a myth-making quality. One was that when I was in Sicily, a woman took me in the great cathedral in Palermo to see, or rather, I don't know how you see it, a vial containing the last breath of Saint Agatha, which I thought was good, because how do you know it's her last breath? You know, what do you do? Stand over there and then strangle her and say, I got it. And then she showed me, because it was obviously very valuable, a feather from the wing of the Archangel Gabriel. And I thought, well, I've seen quite a few of these around, so it must have been a hell of a big angel, because there's a lot of feathers here. Anyway, and then shortly after that, I met this scientist who was trying to disprove things like this. And I thought, well, it's going to be a tricky thing, because this really taps into people's desire to have something mythological, something above us, something more important. And at that,
something above us.
That's right. And at that point, sorry, it's another story. At that point...
No, go. Yeah, I'm going to carry on, absolutely, because it's very
Heather
important.
strikes me as someone who has storytelling and narrative within all her pieces. And I am a storyteller. And of course, having worked in radio, it's storytelling all the time, because you don't get an opportunity to show people anything. You have to it's a joke, you know. The pictures are better on the radio. I met a woman, and this is very appropriate. I met a woman in the early 90s who had been mute since probably, I think, the middle of the 1940s, when she came from a small town in Tuscany. And what had happened was that her village was thought to be partisan and was betrayed to the Germans by another village who were not partisan, who were fascist. And they told the Germans, as the Germans were withdrawing from Italy, that this village was partisan. So the Germans, as they came through, decided to annihilate everybody in the village. And as they came in, this one mother and child, took her daughter, who was very small at the time, and hid her behind those shutters that you get in houses in Italy. And she said, whatever you see and whatever you hear, say nothing. Don't let them know you're here, say nothing, keep quiet. And the little girl did. And she never spoke again. She didn't speak again until the mid-80s. And she was working as a cleaner in a big house, very grand house, and they'd hired her out of the goodness of her heart. She's mute, you know, poor woman, probably slightly, you know, damaged in her brain. And one day she was cleaning the windowsill, and she looked out, and she spoke her first words in 40 years. She said, "It's him! There he is! That's the man!" And she ran after him, and she said, This is the German who came into our village and led them and killed everyone. And the man was in his 20s. And he said, it can't have been me. I am German, but it can't have been me.
Because I'm 20 years old.
But I'm the age that my father was when he went through Italy. And he would never tell us what he did. And he's still alive today. And she said, oh, I'm so sorry. He's probably a very nice man. And he said, no, he's not a nice man. He said, just because people get old doesn't mean they become nice people, So that was like a myth. That was like the most mythological story. And that led into the next book. But again, it's all to do with exactly what you're talking about, this whole need to tell stories and myths and follow those into kind of
the
sacred
thing is,
elements.
The question I keep asking now, given we're living on a precipice, as far as the planet, as far as we, very human-centric, we're 70% of biologists think more. I think, this was in 2005, a very, very good top study. At that point, in 2005, nearly 70% of biologists said we were in the early stages of the 6th mass extinction. And the cause this time is because of
arrogance.
It's the way we are living on the planet. It's the way that we are co-opting nature as a resource to serve our benefit. And in the process of putting ourselves at the center, we are eradicating so many species, and we're eradicating so many people. Already now, the United Nations are saying 300,000 people a year are dying directly as a result of the changing climate. Now, climate change is intrinsically linked in with chlorophyll, because that's where we get our fossil fuels from. That it is. We are mining vast forests. We're pulling up huge oil reserves that were massive photosynthetic blooms that sunk down in the ocean. We have precipitated this absolutely potentially catastrophic in pursuit of chlorophyll, in pursuit of energy. And my question is, how has it come to this? Now, I can understand we're all using far too much carbon. I can understand that we're over-mechanized. I can understand that we're overly polluting. I can understand that we are creating deserts. But I keep asking, but how has it come to this?
Is that what's made you be so much more interested in ecological art pieces?
Well,
if I can put it like that.
It's an investigative work. Because there's no one simple answer. The scientists, we know we have far too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We have too much methane. And no surprises. We have a horrible mechanized animal industry, and we have, things are so out of balance. Now, if you actually go back through history, if you work your way back, a poet like John Clare, desperate about the Enclosure Acts, writing about the loss of trees, the loss of land. You go back, 1600s, we took out a huge amount of forest in this country so we could build our ships, so we could go across to other countries and rape and pillage, And then you go back and you've got the Celtic Druidic forests, and then the Romans arrived and they said, well, they have none of this. Boudica took her own life, but she was protecting the sacred forest. So you keep on going back, and actually, I've gone right back as far as I can within the little bit of potted history I've got. And I actually get back at the beginning of civilization. Great, okay, good place to start. So what's the beginning of civilization?
Is that the bone? No.
No. But where does civilization start? Well, actually, as we understand it, historians deal with nothing prior to the advent of writing, which was the Sumerian times. So in Sumerian times, who was commemorated on those written tablets? Well, it was an epic hero called Gilgamesh. What did Gilgamesh actually do? Well, how did he immortalize his name? Well, Gilgamesh, it seems, took his men and they did a very, very long, dangerous journey, and they went up to the Mount of Cedar and they slayed the forest demon, Huwawa, and they cut the trees.
Down all the cedars of Lebanon.
They cut all of the trees down from the Mount of Cedar. And those trees were then floated down the river. Now, what they actually did, their funeral rites, in Sumerian times was when somebody died, they would bound the bodies and they would float them down the river. And what he did was he transposed the log for the body, and he made his name. So actually, the first civic hero made his name through a mass act of deforestation.
And there's now more cedars of Lebanon in this country than there are in the Lebanese area. The whole Mesopotamia.
Then there.
Yes, I mean, I didn't know that. I mean, I didn't realise you were... that's again, just because I'd be doing a project about the cedars of Lebanon, which is again totally bizarre to me.
That's very strange. Do you think we should open out? Because
Well,
I don't know if we've gone over 45 minutes.
Well, I'm going to tell you about endings.
Yes,
and
do.
why this is the end.
Yes, do endings, and I'll talk about then I could do the ending on the bone, and then we can nearly wrap it up.
There's another good reason I brought this brain in. In 2005, I was asked to be a keynote speaker at a Sci-Art conference in Utah. And I had written this book, Waking Raphael, which was about the restoration of the mute's voice. And I went there and I chose this particular artist that they asked me to choose, and I'm trying to find where she is. She's in here somewhere. It was an exhibition at the Serpentine, and very much about ecology. And God, can I find it now? No. It was a woman who had taught Amazonian parrots to speak. Here's the piece. If you can see it, it's those are real parrots, the shadows, within what she considered to be a sacred grove. She had taught Amazonian parrots to speak a lost language, a language that was nobody spoke it anymore. It was only recorded in the books by Humboldt. And I decided I would write a radio play to go with it. And I started to work with her. About a month after I'd had this conference, and I'd come back with this radio play, I had an epileptic seizure. And then I had another one, and then I had another one. This was in 2005. And I was then diagnosed as having what turned out to be, thank goodness, a benign brain tumor. But the weird thing is, it was in the language processing part of my brain. And the way it affected me, because it was the language processing part, the tumor grew into the right-hand side of my brain and pushed the central cortex into the right-hand side of my brain, which meant that the visual side of me, all the side that I had started out with, became much more... I started doing a lot of drawing. And when I drew, I didn't have seizures.
Interesting.
But when I spoke, if I got too excited... Don't worry, I'm not going to have a seizure, or it's too late now. That would be a good ending, though, wouldn't it? So what happened was, then they told me that if they took the tumour out, the seizures would stop. Well, in a very blackly ironical way, they didn't. And in fact, they continue. And if I write too much, or if I think too much, or if I talk too much, I can have a seizure in which I bite my tongue. Now, this is very unusual for me. I never bite my tongue, as you can see tonight. But it seems to me somebody has a great sense of humour. And one of the ways I can stop myself having a seizure is to be involved with artists. I work with an artist now. In fact, it could be a new collaboration. I work in collaborations with several artists now. One of them's in the audience, in which they send me an image and I respond. So in other words, I don't have to come up with the idea. They come up with the idea and I respond. And when I do that kind of work, I don't have seizures. I'm also working on a novel with the epilepsy as a kind of central core. Now that's, when I try to concentrate too much on that, I can have seizures. So it does seem, in terms of me, that I now have to move into collaborations with artists and poets and people who are not, I don't have to think in the same way I thought before. So that might be the end of one aspect of my writing career and the beginning of another. But what are you doing next week?
But do you, but do you do more drawing? Do you,
do a lot more drawing
as
well?
Of
trees, in fact. I'm obsessed with trees.
I can sympathise with that one, empathise with that.
So the bone? Is this the end? Is this the end?
Nearly. I think so, yes.
What
the
is
bone.
it?
Okay, this is a bone of a polar bear. And we actually came back from an expedition up to the high Arctic with Cape Farewell. And I'm just going to keep this focused because I could transgress onto the whale, but I don't want to. And I think, I'm trying to remember what actually kind of provoked the idea. We had worked quite a lot with crystals and growing crystals onto bones.
Farewell, the name
going back
Farewell?
going back a long time ago. I think the idea was to actually make a diamond out of the bone. So we spoke with the Sisselman, the environmental manager, and she was very nice. And we said, "Can we get hold of some polar bear bones? Because you can't, when you go up to the Arctic, you can't take anything. You can't take bones. You can't take any stones. Everything has to be left untouched. Actually, the only thing we did take off the beaches was piles of plastic rubbish. I mean, because actually it's just the air and the water is so full of pollutants and toxins, because it just seems to it's the way that the currents go and the air currents." And she says, I've got a bone sitting on a shelf. She goes, "I think it might be polar bear. I'll get it checked." And she came back and she said, "Yes, it is polar bear." She goes, "I will do what's necessary and we'll try and get it to you." It took 2 years for it to actually arrive with us. Dan picked it up when he went back out. Dan, who has an uncanny knack for finding either fossils or bones, stepped off in 2007 on the most horrendous journey, which took going across to Greenland, where I think everybody on board went through an existential nightmare, really feared for their life. But they arrived, he ended up on going onto this very lonely spit of land, and he had a hunch. Talk about instinct. He had a hunch. He was looking at the geology, he was looking at the way the water was coming in, and he thought, "I think I could find some bones here." He walked just in front of Marcus Brigstock, the comedian, and there, on this spit of land, was a skeleton, and he knew straight away it was a polar bear. But the skull had gone. Now, Greenland will not allow you to take polar bear out, understandably. They are protected.
Living or dead?
Dead, anyway. There was a slight misunderstanding, a slight ambiguity if it could be muskox. So Dan actually got it back into the country. So this is actually muskox. We've sent the other bone we had off to America. No, Dan went to the barn, he cremated the bone.
Aha!
Cremated the bone.
Fish, blood and bone.
Collected the ash.
We did not
We haven't planned any of this. We actually haven't actually seen each other properly for about 3 or 4 years at all. So there's all of this has been
So I don't know
going on.
any of these stories. This is really not choreographed.
The graphite was extracted from the carbon, from the ash. And of course, the diamond is carbon. It's the hardest form of carbon, which is why it's the most valued gem on the surface of the planet. And graphite is the softest. And the diamond arrives next week, and it will be shown at the Royal Academy in a show called Earth. Sorry, I suddenly feel as though I am plugging a show that's coming up. But it's a group show, and it's called Earth, Art of a Changing Climate. And yes, we have used a huge amount of energy to make the diamond. We're very, very aware of that. And we thought long and hard, do we do this? We don't know how many tons. I keep asking how many tons of carbon have gone into this diamond, and nobody's coming back with an answer.
Well, that should be left there.
But that's the point. Actually, not that I ever really do make a point, but that probably is the most concise point of a piece we've ever arrived at.
And it's a good ending.
And it's a good ending.
Because it is
Absolutely.
a hard crystal on which
it
to
is.
end.
Absolutely.
Can we get you to ask us some questions about further questions? Oh, yep.
I was just going to say, if you want to ask a question, just put your hand up so I can get a mic. It's very useful for us if we can hear your questions because it's being filmed.
Oh, yes, do.
Oh my God, have you been
Oh,
filming
and
us?
please say who you are as well. So there's a name.
And what you do.
Description.
Choreographer, artist, physicist. There are a lot of physicists in the audience here. Could you put your hand up? Look at them all. Look at that. Hundreds of them.
It's an away day, physicist away day.
Diamond dealers. Lend us a fiver.
Talked everybody into quietness.
Come on, put a hand up somewhere. I dare you. They'll just want to go home.
I think we've covered everything.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So we say stop. Don't talk anymore.
I'm supposed. Yeah, I'm an architect. Okay.
Is it on the microwave? I mean the microwave. So I've had a second sip of wine. I told you it all goes.
Anyway, it's the oak trees. What are you doing with them?
I don't know. We don't know. I mean, I don't mean. I'm not just sort of being coy by saying that.
How many of them do you have?
I think we've got about 250, but in some pots there are more trees growing. I think we've kind of sprung a few more. We'll be showing most of them at the Royal Academy show outside the gallery window because they need the winter hardness, to do what they need to do. And then we'd like to bare root them for maybe 4 or 5 years somewhere, and then find it. So it's a very long-term, time-based project. I think most of them will stay in this country. I don't know if they're going to be a mass planting or if it will be a disparate planting. I don't know whether they might. But in the meanwhile, we're doing lots of research. We're speaking with Polly Higgins on the 15th of January. Polly Higgins is a barrister by profession, and she has called upon the United Nations to implement a universal declaration of planetary rights. And they've heard her call, and they're now putting that to the General Assembly. And we're speaking with a guy called Jim Smith on the 11th, and he's Trees and Action Design Group, and they're trying to get developers and architects not to see a tree as an object that has to be removed so that their architecture can happen, but to actually see it as a living entity that nourishes the atmosphere and makes us all healthier, and to keep the tree there and to work their designs around it. And we're speaking with Dr. Roland Enos, who says we need to plant more trees, more green space in the cities to counteract the worst excesses of climate change, because a tree will cool the environment by 4 degrees. You walk down a tree-lined avenue, very pleasant in the summer, hot summer day, you walk down an avenue with no trees and you feel it beating upon you because of transpiration. And we're also looking at Gilgamesh and values of beauty and the sacred and everything. I don't know where to stop. But we'll stay behind it and see what happens.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Cordelia and I'm an artist as well. And I was just wondering if you're ever kind of tempted to get involved with more kind of activism.
Activism?
Yeah, I mean, this kind of... If you
I
look
work with torture survivors. So
Actually, that's right. Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
I do. I mean, that has been before I developed epilepsy. I, like Heather, was getting incredibly furious about the way immigrants, speaking as an immigrant, were treated and why they... And again, you go back to plants again. I thought it was ludicrous that people were saying that they should go back where they came from. And I thought, well, fine, then we'll all go back and we'll take all the things that we brought to this country, like the cedars of Lebanon, and we'll ask back for everything. I mean, in fact, I didn't bring a hell of a lot here, but there is a totem pole from British Columbia that I know the Indians of British Columbia object to violently because it's a bit like stealing someone's mother's tombstone. Of course, I don't have one. But I'm fascinated by, I'm trying to encourage torture survivors, some of whom were tortured because of the way they wrote, or because they did cartoons that their countries objected to because they were satirists of their country's politics. I'm getting them to write their stories, and my husband and I are helping them to edit it and put it into a book form. So, and we are trying to get artists involved in working with them, which is very exciting for them. They would love to work with English artists. Some of them are poets, because like me, it gives them a reason to respond to an English voice or an English, I mean, when I say voice, I mean visual voice as well. So that is, and I am particularly vociferous when everybody or anybody mentions that they should send back the immigrants, because I tell you, we're all going to take the coffee, the tea, the trees, the plants. Fish, Blood and Bone is full of stories about the plants that were brought here by wonderful Scottish botanists. Mm. But, they were immigrants.
So you see that as a form of activism?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. It's the only thing I would, since developing epilepsy, I won't do any book reviewing, I won't do any journalism, all the kind of things that people used to ask me to do, I refuse to do. The only thing I would do is to work with artists because I'm inspired by their work, or to work with torture survivors, and I will write journalism about them and I will do programs about them, but that's it. I'm not interested anymore in selling things.
What was the structure, or how are you enabled to meet these people?
Somebody asked me, it's an accident, my whole life is an accident. I was asked by the head of the Medical Foundation for Victims of Torture to come and mentor. Would I come and mentor some writers, encourage people to start writing who hadn't written before? A lot of these people hadn't been writers in their own countries, but writing, I felt like art, was a way of releasing something that you can't release. Sometimes people are artists because there's something they can't express verbally. They can't maybe talk about the fact that they were abused by their parents or, whatever, but they can do it in a visual sense, they can do it in a poetic sense, because poetry is metaphor, so you can do it. And so that is my way, I suppose. That's how I was asked. I mentor them, and in a way, artists mentor me, because the 3 artists I've been working with, they send me things which help me.
Yeah.
So
I think it becomes a very... I'm aware that the world I occupied as an artist in my 20s and 30s is different to the world. I think I was much more... I think I would disappear into the almost, the kind of the slightly Alice in Wonderland rabbit hole. And even though the politics was going around, and we did sometimes Dan and I would make political pieces, I think we were very pursuing different strands of thinking. And I feel as though I've popped out of that mole hole or rabbit hole. And there's a side to me that wants to go back, especially when I read stuff that depresses me. And I just think, I can't handle this, actually. And the politics and everything that happens around it, I thought, do I really want to become... I remember saying to my mother about a couple of years ago, Mum, And she goes, well, of course you're becoming more political. What do you expect? And I thought, oh, crikey. She was so pragmatic about it. As if to say, you can't actually live your life and reach a certain degree of maturity without becoming politicised. And yet, I still do question it. On the other hand, I think probably we're showing work at the moment down in Bristol with Platform, who are a fantastic arts and activist group, and they've never let go of what happened to Ken Saro-Wiwa and the men who were hung, the Ogoni tribe, and they're not letting go of what's happening in Canada with the tar sands.
I think the other thing
just terrible.
I think the other thing that's really important when we're talking about these global problems is that the youth, you youths here, you young people, don't ever feel that it's not possible to change things. Because it is.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. As far as I'm concerned, if you influence 2 people in the slightest way, just 2 people, you don't have to influence 500, you don't have to be the head of a country. If you influence 2 people, and they influence 2 people, and they influence 2 people, pretty soon you've got a lot of people.
And in fact, the new head of Greenpeace, who was brought up in South Africa in absolute terrible circumstances, and he just says, never ever underestimate the voice that people have. Never underestimate it. And John Jordan, who's a very, very effective artist activist, he said, you've got to read Hope in the Dark. It's actually, and also he's an advocate of civil disobedience, things that we take for granted: the weekend, women having the vote, gay rights. The list has all come about through civil disobedience, as people transgressing the boundaries. So actually, yes, if push comes to shove, I think I would. I'm trying to work with an empathy. I'm trying to bring interdependence, and I'm trying to bring connectivity into play within the way that we negotiate that position.
It's.
I don't want to storm the Bastille yet, because I'm not quite, because we're all part of it.
Go on. Which Bastille?
But I'm part of it. We, as Western civilization, are absolutely, climate change is a chronic systemic disease, if you want to choose that word, of affluent lifestyle. That's me. That was me living the glorious, jet-setting artistic lifestyle.
I'll tell you that...
Having the 3 computers in the house, it's us.
But so one of the things, this is a hopeful thing, because you're talking about deserts. one of the reasons I felt that I could work with tortures of love was I always thought, what am I? Sit here writing books and, I don't know anything about this. I've never been tortured, except thinking by critics, book critics. But I met one of the people I work with is a man from the Sudan who's a very good writer, and he comes from Darfur. And as you can imagine, that his background is fairly awful. He now works for the International Criminal Court, helping to protect people who are in... He can't see his mother because he can't go into Sudan because he's basically persona non grata there. But when I started to talk to him originally, and I was very hushed, the way you feel like you have to talk to it. He was the first torture survivor I'd ever met. And I said, why did you want, because I heard you wanted to come and live in North London. Is it because there's a strong Sudanese community here? And he said, oh no, he said, no. It's because I'm a big football supporter. He said, I support Arsenal, which is my local team, by the way. And I said, you wanted to move to London because you support Arsenal? And I said, God, you must be the only person in Sudan that supports Arsenal. Everybody else must support the local team. And he said, oh no, they all support Man United. And I thought, that is a story, that in terms of the humour, you don't have, they still have this sense of humour. And yet he writes tortured prose. Quite anyway, there we go. Questions?
Any other questions? Sue.
You want, can we all leave? Is that the question?
It's unformed question, but you mentioned the word beauty, and you and I were talking a little bit about that word just before we started talking. And
Which one?
Heather.
Yeah.
And it's a complex word, but you were beginning to say that you felt there was a collective feeling about re-looking at that word and its importance in trying to collect together a different idea of our planet or ourselves. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that.
I think it was somebody talking to me the other night about the exhibition at the National Gallery as well, about the sacred. And then I saw somewhere else, it's slightly out of the corner of my eye, about another art exhibition about beauty, and it's been a word that's been almost vilified. It's sort of been pushed out, and I think it is very, very complex. And what is beautiful, and aesthetics, which visual artists are dealing with. It's a currency that we deal with a lot. And how do you define aesthetics? And if you're playing with words, that notion of anesthetic is where your senses are dulled. Everything is dulled. Your sense of
See, you're a word person.
I love words. So therefore, the aesthetics is to do with a sense of sensory awareness, which I think is to do with the relationship we have with our environment on a very domestic level, on a work level, and broader. And I remember in Canada going into the forests, which is,
there's a lot of those there.
A lot of forests, and seeing beavers who had been at work. And I was shocked by the chaos of it. And I was thinking, this is really disrupted. This is utterly and totally, and it completely challenged that whole notion I had about nature and aesthetics.
They're natural physicists, you see.
Yeah, and they are. It was a chaos theory. Because it's very easy to assume there is this inherent beauty within nature, and actually then you see something very, very chaotic, like a beaver-strewn, lake, and you kind of reprise it. And also, actually, nature isn't benign by any means. It's cataclysmic. It's violent. It throws us off with the shake of the earth and a spurt of huge amount of magma.
I think that's quite reassuring, actually.
But there's something about the sensitivity with which we live within a habitat, which I found myself thinking yesterday, actually, and I thought, as an evolving species, we're very, very young. We're very, very, on the evolutionary scale, we're only just kind of breaking the surface of so many things, I love it when people say, oh, if you were to sit down in the Ritzy cinema and you were to see the story of the planet Earth, you would sit there on January the 1st, 2009, and when you come to the last minute of that year, or the last sort of few seconds, man arrives in the picture. And I say yes, and just as the curtains are closing, women get the vote.
You see, a storyteller, here we go.
It's actually, I really think that if you look at animals, their place, they work their habitat, in a very, very instinctive way. I still think we're looking for our instinct. I think we had instinct and it was taken out, and that's my question. And I think it's to do with beauty, Sue, and I haven't quite nailed it yet.
Do you think we have an instinct, a natural instinct for beauty?
I think it's to do with an aesthetic sensitivity to everything that moves and lives around us. I think it's a very, very sensory thing. And how we construct, how we make things. The toxins and the pollutants we have in our atmosphere are poisoning us. They're poisoning, a woman's breast milk can have 220 different toxin chemicals in it.
But
we're breastfeeding our babies poison.
But the thing that comes, I think...
So where has it gone out of balance,
I think the thing that I find the hopeful about human beings, apart from the fact that they're trying to destroy the planet, and I think that's very egotistical to think we could destroy a planet, because I really think that nature's going to go, oh, basically, fuck you, you'll have to edit that bit out. I think that the whole idea, when you see what a tsunami does, it just shrugs. It goes,
shrugs. Yeah, it's a tidal
Cumbria,
shrug.
You think you're going to build a wall? Let me just show you what you're doing. And, coming from a country where it's really, really good at destroying anything that humans have to do with really quickly, I think the thing that's hopeful, and I think about humans, and I think this audience is an example, although you have to ask more questions, is the questioning nature. Other animals don't question. Humans question. They say, what are we supposed to be? What is beauty? What is aesthetic? What the hell is physics? What are all these things? And I think that's hopeful, because I think the fact that you say you've become politicized is because you've kept on asking questions. And us being up here, and Siobhan invited us to say, what is making? How do you make a book? How do you make a work of art? How do they overlap? That's what we're asking here. We're asking, how do we overlap? How many people can the planet take? How far can we let things go? What is choreography? What is the difference between dancing and walking and playing, a kid playing? At what point? You've seen kids, they do choreography. What's the difference? We were discussing, Siobhan and I were discussing the fact, in fact, my husband and I were watching, having just come out of the Frank Auerbach exhibition at the Courtauld. We sat there having a drink, watching people ice skating in Somerset House. And Andrew said, they're always ice skating counterclockwise. Do they ever change and go the other way? I said, have you ever tried to ice skate clockwise? It's really difficult. Why is that? Well, when I grew up ice skating, because there's a lot of ice in Canada as well, nobody ever ice skated the other way. I mean, unless they were performing. But in ice rinks, they always skated in a counterclockwise way. The same thing we were saying about in theatre. It's natural. It should be, that when you watch theatre, you like people to enter from one side and leave from the other. So the natural instinct is to come from the left and exit from the right. And Siobhan pointed out to me that's because we read that way. So immediately the question that comes to mind for me is, in Japan, is it different? In any place where they speak Arabic, and I will go back and ask the friends I know who speak Arabic, when you watch theatre, do you expect them to come from right to left or left to right? So
that's interesting.
But I think that's the hopeful thing about humans, is they will keep on asking, how do we live on this planet? How many people can we afford to have? Where do acorns? How many trees can you grow from? Boys' acorns?
Well, it's again, it's that thing where we stop objectifying and mechanizing our systems of delivery and our systems of making. It's, at what point can our production methods actually be nutritious? And why shouldn't they be? It just takes a big shift.
I've got a question to ask the audience. Why did you come here tonight? Was it to listen to choreography? Go on, you. How come you came here? What, are you an artist or a writer or a...
No, I'm a therapist.
Are you? And what made you come? What made you come and listen to? I know, isn't this mean? It's my natural BBC radio interview. What made you want to listen to an artist and a writer having a conversation? You got dragged here. No.
No, I didn't. I'm actually always interested in just listening to people talking about things, and it's like scratching for ideas to me. That's
Really?
what I like.
For a choreographer?
Just by listening to what somebody else is saying, yes.
Just like us, really.
Yeah.
Next, you. Isn't this mean? You can all, sort of curse me afterwards.
I was going to ask you about the question, what do you do with your working notes? And as you become older, do you keep them, how do you decide what form to keep them in? And are they a problem? Oh, they're very...
I'm finishing this one, actually,
Yeah,
as
what
we
else?
are here with Leslie and Siobhan Davies, and I've just greeted the back. I normally leave one page because I make kind of more, slightly more just kind of notey things at the back. I have 10 of these, 12 of these, and hardly any of them have any drawings in. I don't draw, I write. I like script, I like writing.
And this is a project it's ongoing.
Oh, and of course the body of work, but
with an artist. And she approached me. I'd written I'd been asked by an art curator to write a very short story to accompany 3 drawings by an artist called Sarah Woodfine. And at the opening of this, and I thought, oh, this is fun. It's short, it's good, easy. It's much more difficult, actually. But at that opening, another artist came to me, this etcher called Una Grimes, who's a wonderful artist, and she said, I've got this idea for a project, but I don't know if you'll be interested because there's no money in it. And she said, what I want to do is to send you this picture and you respond. So she started to send me etchings, and I would write a story based, not an illustration, but just inspired. In the same way that if you got up and said, look, I've got this idea for some choreography, or you showed me some dance steps, which is like a sketch, a little drawing, I could write a story about that, because that's where... But sometimes I was really busy because I was doing other things. So I would send her just my written notes, scribbled, and she would respond by sending something else. And sometimes, because I write sort of what they call literary thrillers, or in which there's a lot of death, I was quite interested. This is an anatomical drawing when they find corpses. It was given to me by a forensic pathologist whose lab looked very much like a kind of Milanese, very trendy kitchen. So I would send her, and my husband, this is on tracing paper. My husband then, the curator said, would you be interested in turning it to a book? And I said, well, okay, I said, but, if I were going to have this published, I'd really edit it a lot. And she said, no, I like it just to be the way it is. So I said, well, how are we going to do it? And Una would, although I would post my work to her, she would deliver things mysteriously. We have no deadlines, it just turns up. And her envelopes were sometimes amazing. So there would be an envelope with this piece of paper that had a brain on either side of it, and you had to decide, how are you going to cut it? Do you cut it through the brain? Do you try and steam the brain off? This was sent before we knew that I had and then when it came to make a book, my husband is a graphic designer, and he said, well, I'd really like somehow to get the aspect of how you work. So he said, okay, she sent you this image, and you've responded, and he said, I'd like to show the tracing paper, like showing that the idea shines through your work. And he also did, for example, I would send, there's that piece of
Oh,
You
yeah.
know, he did it on tracing paper, so you could see through how our ideas worked, how her ideas came from the right-hand side and the left-hand side, because she keeps notes like you, and I quite often I would just draw something.
Let's have a look.
I would just do a little
yeah.
sketch, because I never knew the difference between a butte and a mesa. So I sort of scribbled it down.
What's that? Sorry, I don't even know what.
Well, a mesa is a flat one, and I think that's it. I'd have
A
flat piece of, like on the desert, you get something goes up
okay.
like that, flat, and comes down.
Okay.
You know, the Grand Canyon and all
Yes,
that stuff.
yes.
Anyway, it's now bound in a very kind of showy. In fact,
How many editions do you have? Is it an edition as such?
Somebody asked me recently at sort of literary thing. They said, "You wrote Waking Raphael, but that was 2003, and what have you done since? You know, have you written anything since? How many copies have you sold?" And I said, "Yes, I've written one book, and it sold one copy. However, it was bought by the British Library for £2,000.
Yes.
So I thought that was pretty good. You know,
Yeah.
one copy. But if I sold 100 copies, I'd probably make more than the most famous author on the planet.
There
with
you
their hardback
go.
books. So anybody here that wants to buy a book for 2,000 quid, it's not that one. It comes all, bound up. That's a long answer to a short question. Who else is back there? Man in an orange t-shirt. Choreographer, artist, writer, dragged here by your girlfriend. Your mother said you had to come. What do you do?
Choreographer.
Hi.
Dancer and choreographer.
And why?
Choreographer.
And dancer.
Yeah.
And interested in art and writing, storytelling, narrative. Did you know about either of us? You thought we were going to be Cornelia Parker and Lavinia
I
Greenlaw?
did think you were going
Oh,
to,
I'm
but I do know Heather's work as well.
I've never written any poetry. I'm really sorry.
I'm curious about your thoughts on that central question of choreography, and in light of your kind of dialogue about making, if you feel you can respond or contextualize those ideas within this question of choreography.
The artist or the writer?
Both of you, yeah.
I nearly heard. I don't think the microphone's working properly.
In terms of what we've talked about, could you contextualize choreography? How do you respond to it? Could you, for example, if you saw a dancer, could you respond with a visual image or a work of art?
No, sorry.
No.
I meant, do you understand the idea of choreography in your own work? That kind of.
Do I understand the idea of choreography in my own work?
Yeah, that question that Sue prompted the I didn't ask them that. No, but the
it's
question
your
that prompted the inquiry. I'm curious if how that would feed into this conversation.
I think. Well, actually, interestingly, a lot of the performance work that I was doing, this isn't a very obvious, explicit answer, but a lot of the performance work I was doing in the 20s had a very, very distinct, natural, it was choreographed, in lots of ways. A piece of theatre, a piece of performance, because it inhabits the same sort of space and place and time zone as dance. You're still doing with how you place, who stands where, and even just gesture. How do you do that? And just talking a little bit more about the performance thing, I think it's always important. It's always that thing about when is the gesture mannered, and when is it really intuitive to some extent. And I think you can probably step out and also say, with the ideas that one has and the way that one is constructing work, at what point is the idea overly managed, overly forced, and somehow, too controlled? And at other times, how is it actually incredibly precise and very kind of intuitive? And it's certain ideas. Actually, I find this work that we're doing I find it has an inherent natural choreography, if I can use that word, because it just seems to keep opening up. It feels, for me, it connects with the way I felt with Grass all those years ago, which was that sense of profound recognition, and it's to do with an alliance of stuff that just moves around and allows the uninvited guest to participate. I don't really know what I'm saying, actually, I'm sorry.
Well, actually,
It's all getting a bit waffly around the edges.
No, Heather, because it's interesting I mean, for me, in terms of choreography, a long time ago, it sounds like it was a song, when Siobhan Davis was dancing with London Contemporary Dance, I worked as the graphic designer, designing the posters, and I had a huge crush on one of the dancers, Darshan Birla, who was... Now that's a footnote, it's an aside acknowledgement.
But an important one.
And I have to admit, it wasn't his dancing, he just had a great body. Anyway, sorry, aside. If I told you about the mute that I had met and the story I wrote called Waking Raphael, which was again about a particular painting called La Muta, which means the mute in Italian. It's done by Raphael, but in Italian it can also mean the woman who chooses not to speak. And I had begun, because I knew a dancer, I had begun the story as an idea, as a dance, a piece of dance theatre, in which the old mute was played by an older dancer, because I always objected to the idea that at a certain age people weren't allowed to dance anymore. Why not? They have a kind of movement. Sometimes they have an intrinsic grace, and that this mute, because the story goes backwards and forwards in time, that you would have all these different ages of dancer through the time when she was young and beautiful, but she was invisible because she was mute. When she was a child, so I had imagined, I tend to I storyboard my books a lot. I tend to draw pictures of how I imagine it. And I imagined this scene in which, because she's mute, it was played by a dancer, and the dancer danced her feelings. And the other very important character in the book is a wolf, who is silent, who is silent as well, obviously, but is almost like a ghost, and is almost like the good and the wild, the unanswered question in the book, and also the question about, she's wild at the time she's found living in a hole in the ground basically, but fed by the people in the villages, but nobody will admit. They all know who she is and what happened to her and what happened to the village, but nobody will admit. It's all about silence and this kind of the dance around this. I mean, this was literally how I imagined it. The dance around this central idea of a terrible secret that nobody wanted to talk about. First of all, because in Italy, it's very dangerous. That problem, those people are still alive. They're still in power, they're still killing people. The mafia is very closely linked to the church. So there are all these silent figures. So it was exactly thought of in terms of choreography. And for a while I did sort of play around with the idea, not that I know anything about, choreographing dance, but I had sort of tried to write a script around and said, sort of left a hole and said, somebody could choreograph a dance here. And in fact, I'm still in touch, very good friends with one of the original dancers from London Contemporary Dance, who's now in her 60s. And I said, Maggie, I would just love it if you would play the old one. She said, I can't dance anymore. I said, Maggie, you can still lift your leg straight up in the air. And, she's got legs this long, a bit like Siobhan. She could sort of stand on one tiptoe and touch the roof. And I said, it would be wonderful. And then have a young... But anyway, I did think of it exactly as choreography.
But there's always friction. You never get away from that, and there's always tension. That it's
what between the
but you have ideas, friction.
Yeah.
You have friction of ideas, friction the way that we are. Yeah. It is a good way to end. Yes, it is. Good. Thank you.
Such a great audience.
Thank you. Thanks very much.